Today we're going to play Spot the Fallacy with Frank Turek, or more specifically, one tweet from Frank Turek. Now, I've posted a lot of videos about Frank Turek, and in some respects, you could say he's probably not worthy of the attention. Why do I bother to interact with Frank Turek's stuff a lot? Well, and one reason is just because Twitter keeps throwing me his tweets, because I guess I'm on a vicious feedback loop. But really, Frank Turek is a great example of how not to do apologetics time and again. And given his significant popularity within the conservative evangelical community, he just becomes an important interlocutor to engage with for what not to do. And here's another great example of that. So let's take a look at the tweet and then we're going to discuss the fallacies. So here's the tweet, just posted again this morning, October 4th, 2024. I've hardly ever seen a so-called deconstruction where somebody leaves Christianity, they deconstruct their faith, that does not somehow bring up sexual behavior as a reason they left Christianity. Now, if you think you've seen this tweet before, you may have. He's posted it at least 2 times previously verbatim. I know that some people recycle their tweets. Frank Turek does that a lot. Some of his tweets have been retweeted, copy pasted into new tweets multiple times. It's a sort of interesting ethical discussion here about whether one should be just copy pasting their tweets into new tweets or rather retweeting old tweets so that people know that they're getting recycled material. I'll leave that discussion for another day. But let's just talk about the fallacies here. So the first fallacy that I want to identify in this tweet is, what is called the definist fallacy. The definist fallacy involves defining a term in a biased, tendentious manner. And that's one that serves your interests in an argument. And that's what Turek does here when he defines deconstruction as leaving Christianity or apostatizing altogether. Now, certainly deconstruction can include apostatization or deconversion, but it doesn't necessarily, by definition, include that at all. Deconstruction simply refers to the process by which a person begins to think critically about doctrines that they had previously accepted uncritically, and then ends up revising or rejecting particular doctrines or understanding of those doctrines through the process of critical reflection. For example, back in the 1990s, early 1990s, I was a young earth creationist. I believed in eternal conscious torment. I believed that you had to pray a sinner's prayer in order to be saved. Those doctrines were all deconstructed for me in the early to mid 1990s. By the mid 1990s, I accepted theistic evolution or evolutionary creation, certainly accepted an old earth. I accepted that an annihilationist view of posthumous judgment rather than eternal conscious torment, and I became an inclusivist, believing that a cognitive confession of faith in Jesus was not a necessary condition for salvation. There's all sorts of reasons why each one of those, I adopted those positions. But suffice it to say, that was a deconstruction, but I was still very much Christian and indeed an evangelical Christian. It just wasn't as conservative an evangelical Christian, you could say, as I once was. When Turek defines deconstruction in this way as outright apostasy or rejection of the faith in toto, what he does is he sets up the argument so that anybody who is describing their journey as deconstruction now, the conservative evangelical critic trained by Turek is going to look at their process as a process of apostasy, of outright rejection of Christian faith altogether, which again is a highly tendentious, biased, and just false way of defining the journey that they may be on. The second fallacy that we see here is classic example of the hasty generalization fallacy. This is where you base a very broad conclusion on a small sample. The way that Turek puts it here is, I've hardly seen anybody who doesn't invoke this explanation as a factor in their deconversion process. Okay, the issue here, it's so obvious in so many other parts of our life. For example, if a person says, I've never met an immigrant who wasn't lazy. I mean, people right away recognize that what that is a rank prejudicial attitude, even conceding that it were true that that person had not met an immigrant who wasn't lazy, which of course you're going to question at the outset. There still is the additional issue here that even if all the immigrants that you had met were lazy, it wouldn't follow that immigrants are all lazy. That would be an obvious case of a hasty generalization fallacy, that you're drawing this general broad conclusion based upon a limited sampling. And even if you conceded it were true that Turek has hardly ever met someone who underwent deconstruction who didn't there appeal to sexual behavior as a reason for leaving Christianity, it wouldn't follow that this is just a broad conclusion is warranted from Turek's limited sampling set. It's just obvious. But this is just a gross appeal to a hasty generalization. Now, there's an additional issue here, which I just want to unpack for a minute. Actually, two things which are really beyond the periphery directly of addressing the fallacies here, but are relevant nonetheless. The first thing is that when people appeal to their personal experience, what they're doing strategically is placing their claims beyond critical rebuttal, direct rebuttal, because all they're doing is appealing to their personal experience. So if you say, well, that's false, they can say, well, no, that's my experience, right? And you can't directly falsify their experience unless, for example, you've been with them all the time and you can attest to the fact that, no, that's really not true what you're saying about your own experience. Most of us cannot speak about Frank Turek's experience. So he's placed his claims beyond rebuttal here. But of course, the claims themselves are borderline vacuous because it's a hasty generalization. All he's really doing here is appealing to his own limited experience. Okay, there is another thing. I guess I could have classified this as a fallacy as well, but I didn't bother to do that. But you could say there's a fallacy of equivocation here. So I'm not listing it as one of the fallacies formally, but I think it is there. And the fallacy of equivocation is appealing to sexual behavior. When Frank Turek describes this as an appeal to sexual behavior, he's equivocating between a person wanting to engage in a sexual behavior and a person simply having a revised understanding of sexual ethics. And I think it's quite intentional that he's ambiguating between those two. The former, engaging in sexual behavior, is a different claim than the latter, simply having a revised view of sexual ethics. And I mean, you can have a revised view of sexual ethics in all sorts of ways. For example, it was common 40 years ago among conservative evangelicals to believe that a husband cannot rape their wife because within the institution of marriage, each spouse owns the other spouse. Uh, and you should not deprive another spouse of conjugal relations. And the idea of raping one spouse was just not something that people thought really was a thing. If you then come to deconstruct that specific claim and believe, no, a spouse can sexually assault their partner, that is a revised understanding of sexual behavior. But it's one that I think is certainly something everybody should accept. So, Turek really leaves it ambiguous as to what he means by adopting a revised understanding of sexual behavior. And that's just a way of getting to another fallacy we're about to come to, which is poisoning the well. Okay, we're now going to look at the next two fallacies, including poisoning the well. But first, we want to get to appeal to motive. Both of these final two fallacies are expressions of the general ad hominem fallacy. As you probably know, ad hominem is attack upon the man or attack upon the person. Uh, it's directed at the individual making a claim rather than at the claim itself. In the case of appeal to motive, this is a claim where, well, we're not going to look at the arguments, in this case, the arguments you've given for deconstruction. Rather, we're going to look at the motives or what we perceive to be the motives that undergird your acceptance of that position. And by taking that view, arguing against the person's motives, saying the motives undercut that they're illegitimate motives, is a way of not addressing the argument itself. It's instead just redirecting to the motives. In this case, the motives are, quote, sexual behavior as a reason for deconstruction. And I've already said, of course, you could have very good motives. I mean, if the idea, and again, there's an ambiguation here between desire to have sex, which is really what Turek, I think, is wanting people to think without outright saying it, versus having a revised view of some aspect of sexual ethics, such as in the most obvious case that it's wrong, or you can sexually assault your spouse, and would be wrong to do so. Uh, but here, he's just kind of throwing it out there, implying that people have hedonistic motives. And that hedonistic motive is really what undergirds their deconstruction. He doesn't say it overtly, but he clearly implies that a hedonistic motive undergirds deconstruction. And so you can repudiate and reject the deconstruction of these individuals because they're really motivated by these hedonistic motives for sex. The final thing he says is another aspect of ad hominem, which is poisoning the well. Here, to poison the well is to get people to think negatively about the entire argument of the process of deconstruction or those who deconstruct as a group, because you've now aligned them as being motivated by hedonistic sexual motives. So you don't need to consider what they have to say. Not only have you impugned their motives, but you've just generally poisoned the well against them. So then now people are prepared to think, oh, you're just motivated by your hedonistic desire to have sex, which is sexual behavior as being a reason undergirding your deconstruction. So 4 or 5 fallacies here in one tweet from Frank Turek. I mean, this is impressive. There are few apologists as skilled, if this is a skill, there are few apologists as skilled today as Frank Turek in their ability to pack informal logical fallacies into as few words as possible. Frank Turek is a master of doing this. And that's one reason why, time and again, I come back to Frank Turek's apologetics, because he shows us in such a concise and articulate manner how not to do apologetics.